What's up friends, today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. In this video we're going to be upgrading a client's build to a full new mechanical system, including hanger, motors, belts, pulleys, and pretty much everything you could ask for. Let's jump right into this video on how to assemble one of the best budget belt drives on the market, the Boardnamics Idler Belt Drive. Some of you might be coming from my Boardnamics all-terrain steel gear drive tutorial, and if you are, welcome. But if not, find that linked in the iCard. It's another super interesting tutorial from the same company. The Boardnamics belt drive, specifically the Idler one, is one of my favorite belt drives out there. I think it's one of the best budget ones you can buy. In this video, we're going to be setting it all up, like I said in the intro, and the first thing we needed to do is actually disassemble what we've currently got here. So we're gonna get on that right away, but if you want to find a specific part in the video, feel free to use the chapters. Otherwise, just go ahead and stay for the whole thing. Let's get right into it. Some of you guys might recognize this setup from old times in the past. This is the classic Torque Boards single setup with a good old Turnigy aero drive motor on there. This is a 15mm belt setup, but I know this client still experienced quite a bit of belt skip, and fortunately with this new belt drive we will not have that issue. So let's get it disassembled. Now that this old setup is completely stripped down to just the base plate, it's time to pull out the new gear. I'm going to lay it all out so you guys can see everything, and then we'll start installing it. Now that you've seen all the parts, we've got to start on the first step, which is going to be assembling the pulleys. For this step, you're going to need 4 of the M4x8 screws, which also happen to be the same as the ones that you're going to use to mount your motors. You're going to need your 2 wheel adapters, and you're going to need your 2 pulleys. This step is pretty easy and should only take you a couple of seconds. If these pulleys don't come already assembled, you're going to just take your wheel adapter and you're going to line it up with the 2 holes that are in the actual pulley. Set them on top of each other and put the screws in. Again, like I said, you're going to want 2 of your M4x8mm screws, and you're going to want some Loctite for this as well. I recommend using red Loctite, or 263 or 262, which is 2 different versions of red. I ran out of red, so I'm using blue for right now, but before I give it to my client, I will be switching this Loctite out to a permanent one. You should never need to disassemble this part of the actual pulley as this part is meant to be permanently installed. So all we're going to do is Loctite it up, lightly tighten it down, put the other one in, nice crank. There you go, there's your fully assembled wheel pulley with the adapter on it. These black ones are actually an older version. They work just fine, but if you buy some of these pulleys today, you'll probably get ones that have a silver version of this wheel adapter. Same thing though. Our next step is another simple one. And again, you can use red Loctite for this. Some people use blue for this, and some people run these without Loctite. My recommendation is that you do red, just because you probably will never need to touch your axles once you install them. But because I don't have any red right now, I'm going to put blue in, and I have blue on some of my other trucks and they're perfectly fine. But your mileage may vary, and my official recommendation is to go with red. So your axles are probably going to come packaged like this in this plastic, and they're going to have some oil on them. That is to keep them from rusting. And they're quite oily, so you can wipe off a little bit when you unpackage it, but I recommend leaving some on there at least to keep the axles in good condition. It's important when you put the Loctite on these axles that you apply it carefully, because if you accidentally get Loctite on the shaft of the axle instead of on just the threads, you could have issues getting it threaded in, and the seal inside of the hanger itself with this axle is very tight. You can hear the pop sound when I take it out. It's pretty satisfying. But anyways, we're gonna get some blue Loctite on here, and we're gonna thread these in. It's also worth mentioning, for these you're going to want a 4mm Allen key. As you screw this in, you're just going to screw it in until it stops, and it should be pretty obvious, so you just won't be able to turn it any further. There we go, that one is nice and tight. We'll do the other side now. Next thing we're going to do is work on assembling the actual mounts onto the hangers. At this point of the build process, you're going to have to decide if you want to have your hangers forwards facing or rear facing. And I believe that with this belt drive you can do either way. On my street setup, I have it facing with the motor mount straight out the back like this. And I know I've seen other builds with it facing the other direction. So now's the time you want to make that decision. You can line up your mounts however you like and decide which way is going to work best for you. For this particular setup, it looks like I'm going to have some issues colliding with the enclosure if I forwards mount them, so we're going to have to do rear mounting on this particular setup. You can just slide these on as is, and we're just going to hand tighten everything to prepare for actually getting this mounted properly. With your dual belt setup, you're going to have two mount plates. And these mount plates are going to mount onto these mounting clamps. These mount plates have two sides on them. And on one side you'll find an indentation. That side is the side that will house the screw heads. So you're going to want to have the side with the screw heads facing outwards. Additionally, the opposite side has a slot for the idler nut, so you definitely want to make sure that is also facing the inside of the truck. So for now, you can just hang your mounts onto the truck with the indentation side facing outwards. And next we're going to go ahead as I was saying, for the next step, we're going to grab our next set of bolts. For this, we have M4 by 20 bolts. You're going to have 8 of these. Now, this step is where you're going to set your mounting plate orientation. And we're just going to stick bolts in here temporarily. So don't worry too much about it yet, but what you're going to do is just go ahead and stick bolts through at the position where you think you're going to mount it. And you can just let it hang there. For me, I think that this position is going to be what I'm going to mount it at, and we'll see in a minute if the motors are going to end up hitting the base plate or hitting the deck. Hopefully they will not. Now that we have our mounts roughly in the correct angle, we are going to grab our M4 nuts and just finger tighten them onto the ends of the bolts that hold the mount angle in place. The next step I'm going to do is go ahead and put on these idler pulleys and just lightly set them in place. For this one, you're going to need a 5mm Allen key, and it's pretty simple to put on. All you have to do is stick the idler through there, through the slot on the mount, and then you're going to tighten it down. Once we get to the part where we actually fully assemble this, you're going to want to tighten this down in the place where it best sets your mount. And the nice thing is, since there is a slot for the nut here, all you have to do is just use the mount to tighten it down rather than having to use a wrench or something like that. So just go ahead and tighten that down on there temporarily. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Now, if all goes well, as it should, your idler pulley should spin fairly easily with not very much resistance. If there is resistance, something has gone wrong and you should try and reset it in place. Let's move on to the next step. All right, the next step we're actually going to do is an alignment. And to do that, we're going to have to get a few things ready. We've got our pulleys, both of those. We've got our wheels. We got our mounts just loosely held in place. And now the next thing we're going to need is our spacers. So there's actually 2 sizes of spacer that should come with this kit. One is 6mm thick. The other one is 4.6, or I'm guessing this is about 5mm thick. Your 5mm thick spacers just go right onto the axle. These are meant to space out your pulley to properly set it in the right place. Next, you're going to just go ahead and slide your pulley on. All right, we got to pause for just a second and address something. So these drives, or these belt drives, don't come with an instruction set, so I got a little bit confused about what these spacers were meant for. So we're going to correct that now. This skinny one, which is the, I think it was 4mm one, this one goes in the wheel, and it's meant for Kegel wheels like these 85mm ones. So this goes between the pulley and the bearing on the wheel. So like I had said earlier, it goes in there, but I said earlier that the thick one goes in there, which is incorrect. The skinny one goes in there on Kegel wheels, and on ABEC core wheels, you would use the thicker one. So this small spacer is not meant to go on the axle. However, I've already set my drives. You'll see I've already set these drives in place. So what I'm going to do is replace this skinny spacer with some washers, and we'll just be on our way. So no worries if you are at the point before you set your mounts in place, then use the skinny one for Kegel wheels and the thick one for ABEC wheels. If you have a little bit of trouble with this, you can actually just take a little bit of sandpaper just to the edge between the threads and the axle itself, as sometimes there's a little bit of a burr there and it gets stuck. Now that you have your pulley sitting on the axle, you're going to take your 6mm spacer and slide that on as well. This spacer is meant to space out the pulley from the wheel so that you can have a nice strong setup going, only putting pressure on the metal parts of the bearing rather than on the more sensitive casing or creating any weird forces that you don't want to have. So you don't actually have to put the wheel on right now. I'm just demonstrating what it's going to look like. And it might actually be easier for you to put the pulley on the wheel beforehand. But I just wanted to show you guys what it would look like. So yeah, it's definitely easier to do beforehand. Anyway, we're gonna skip the wheel for right now. This is the alignment step. So basically what we're gonna do is make sure that our pulley is pressed all the way up against that spacer. And all we have to do is look at the spacing between the mount plate and the pulley. And what we're going to be aiming for here is for the idler bearing area to line up perfectly with the belt area on the pulley. In this particular setup, I'm going to need to slide it a little bit closer. And the spacing that you're going to have here between the pulley and the actual face of the mount is going to be pretty skinny, probably only about 1 millimeter. And you can pretty much just eyeball this, but if you want to use something straight to line up your idler pulley with your actual wheel pulley, you can do that as well. I'm just going to eyeball it. So we have the approximate location that we know that it needs to be at. And now is a good time to apply some blue Loctite onto the threads of the large bolt that holds the mount in place. What we've got here on my setup are the precision clamps for the Boardnamics hanger. So they might look a little bit different than yours, but basically all I'm going to do is put some blue Loctite into the threads, and that's going to keep it nice and sturdy. We'll just go ahead and tighten this back in with our finger. Now the goal here is to set the motor mount almost perfectly in place so as to make the rest of the setup go easier. So as soon as you got that set in place, lined up with the pulley, you can go ahead and carefully tighten it down with your 5mm Allen key. This can be adjusted later if necessary. The idea here right now is to get this set up properly so we can see if the motors are going to hit the deck. Now that we've got this C-clamp tightened in place, at least enough to not have it accidentally shift, you can take off the pulley and the spacer. And what we're going to do next is actually tighten down one of the mount bolts. So you should use a crescent wrench for this, but I'm just going to use needle nose pliers because I have them on hand. So we're just going to go ahead and tighten this down. And the main purpose here is to see exactly what angle the mount is at and mount the motor to it to make sure that we're going to clear the deck. Okay, our mount plate is secure enough for now. So now we're going to go ahead and grab a motor. All right, so we've got our motor here, and this is one of the Boardnamics 6355 motors, which should look very nice and perform quite well. And what we're going to do is we're going to temporarily put it in place on the motor mount. For this, we're going to need 4 of the M4x8 screws. Now we're just going to go ahead and hand tighten it in enough so that we can see where the motor is going to end up. You actually don't need to put all 4 screws in right now. I'm just going to do 2 for the moment. All right, so we've got the motor mounted now, temporarily anyway. Before you mount it permanently, you'll want to put Loctite on. And we're just going to do a clearance check here. And the way you do this is you loosen up the kingpin of the truck almost all the way. With the truck all the way loose, you can go ahead and bend the motor mount down as far as you can and see if it's going to hit the edge of the motor. And for me, it's pretty close. But it looks like we're going to just clear, and that's on very extreme turns. It does actually touch if I press it hard enough. I think with the bushings tightened down, it should be fine. If it ends up being a problem, it's pretty easy to readjust the motor mount angle later, so we're just going to assume that it's going to be okay for now. So I did actually make a mistake here. Normally you should install the mount with the idler pulley facing the top side so you don't hit rocks and stuff with it. So we're just going to go ahead and switch sides for these mounts real quick. So here's the current state of things. On here we tightened down the hanger nut again, just so it's easier to work with. We've got our clamp on this side, which we already spaced out, completely tightened down. We've got the 4 mount plate screws tightened down all the way. Got the motor temporarily mounted without Loctite yet. We got our idler pulley here, and we pretty much just have to do the same exact thing on the other side. So we're going to stick the spacer on, stick the pulley on, space it out, and then we'll tighten down the clamp with Loctite, and then after that we will tighten down the 4 mount plate screws, and then we'll stick the motor on there temporarily, and then we'll be good to go. All right, so this is one of our final steps, and we're almost done with this build. On the table here, we've got our wheel pulley, our wheel with the pulley spacer, our motor pulley, and our belt. In this particular setup, I'm going to be running 325mm belt, and it is 15mm wide, 5M profile. And that is to be paired with a 40-tooth wheel pulley and a 15-tooth motor pulley. So first thing we're going to do is actually install the pulley onto the wheel. And all you have to do for this is just set the spacer on and press the wheel pulley in. And because the spacing is done so well, the bearing will actually hold the spacer in place when you go to put it on the actual board. And you can see here, it's a nice tight fit. Got the pulley on the wheel. We're gonna go ahead and do that for the other side right now too, real quick. Okay, now our next step is going to be getting the motor pulley ready to go on. Now these motors are a little bit shorter shafts than some other ones, so the shaft length of your motor will depend on which one you get exactly. But for this one, we're going to be using the key provided with the motor and these Boardnamics 15-tooth motor pulleys. And for these, I'm going to stick the key into the motor shaft. Squeeze it in there. And then I'm actually going to apply a little bit of blue Loctite on the key because it can help keep it in place. I guess we'll leave it in there. I'm gonna put a little bit of blue Loctite on the key. And we're going to slide on the motor pulley. It doesn't really matter which direction you slide it on with the Boardnamics ones because they are symmetrical. Now, I'm going to slide this on until it is very close to the motor mounting plate. And before you do this, you want to make sure your motor screws are Loctited in place and everything, because it just gets more annoying after that. Now, once you have it set, for me it's pretty close to the mounting plate, but should be perfect right there. And going to want to grab your set screws. So each pulley will come with 2 little tiny set screws, and these are what you're going to use on your motor pulley. So for these, I like to apply the Loctite into the threads on the motor pulley side. You definitely don't want these coming out, so you definitely want a good amount of Loctite in there. And now we're going to grab a small Allen wrench, probably a, let's see, a 2 maybe? No, 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench. And we're going to work these in. So in order to fully get the Loctite on the threads, I'm going to screw it in and loosen it a little, and then screw it in and loosen it a little, screw it in, loosen it a little, screw it in, loosen it a little, and then once it hits the bottom, I'll tighten it up. Same thing with the second one. Screw it in, loosen it a little, screw it in, loosen it, screw it in, loosen it, screw it in. And this will get the Loctite worked into those threads really nicely. Now you're going to want to make sure you switch to the other end of your Allen key and give it a nice tighten up. I prefer to tighten the one that is nearly opposite the keyway first, and then the one that is more perpendicular to it. Get those nice and tight, and then we're just going to go in there and soak up the extra Loctite with a shop rag. All right, we're gonna repeat this for the other side and then we'll move on to the next step. So this is one of our last steps and it's a little bit annoying, so I went ahead and pulled off the idler just so we can make this easier. What you're gonna do is you're going to go ahead and stick your belt onto your mount around the motor pulley. And you're going to just go ahead and slide on the wheel. If you find something in the wheel stack up is getting out of place, you can stick an Allen wrench down the axle, and that usually helps me get things centered. So I'm just gonna push it down and on. And I like to just slowly turn the belt onto the pulley. And it should be pretty straightforward to get the belt on. Now, we're just gonna leave this loose for now, and we can go ahead and install the wheel nut. Now is a good time to do a friction check. This should spin pretty freely, and it does. So we're good on this side. Now we're just gonna go ahead and install the wheel and the belt on the other side using the same exact technique. All right, so we've got the second wheel on. We got all the belts on there. We got them not tightened yet, but they're almost there. So we're pretty much done here, and we're just gonna flip it over, put the idlers back on, and then we'll be pretty much good to go. All right, so this is the very last step we're going to do, and we're going to be putting the idlers back on. Now, part of a healthy belt drive is setting proper belt tension, and honestly, the tension right now is actually pretty decent. You could probably even run this size belt without the idlers on it. Honestly, for the idlers, I might recommend maybe 330 millimeters. I think that might be a little bit better, especially depending on what kind of setup you've got with your pulley ratio. So we're gonna put this back on here just because it is part of the setup, and we're just gonna put it in at like the lightest tension that it can be, because it just doesn't need too much. So we're just gonna slide that right in there, and since this nut locks into the actual slot, all you have to do is tighten it down. Now that seems pretty good. We're pretty much at the loosest that this idler drive can go, and as you can see, it still spins pretty nicely, albeit a little bit tight. So I'm gonna go ahead and mess with this a little bit and see if I can set the correct belt tension, and then we'll do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll finish it off with some nice B-roll of the completed setup. All right, so that's pretty much all the steps that you gotta do to fully assemble a Boardnamics Idler Belt Drive. A couple of things to note, before you ride the drive, you definitely wanna wait a full day, 24 hours, to make sure all of your Loctite, your blue Loctite, and your pulleys and on your screws and everything, make sure all that sets up real nice before you go out and ride. Make sure your idlers are set correctly. The tension should be just a little bit of flex to the finger, and you should have pretty decent free roll. Obviously with an idler belt drive, you're going to have a little bit less free roll than a non-idler, but you will never have belt skip. And if you do have belt skip on an idler belt drive, something is not set up right. So yeah, anyway, this is a pretty simple setup. Lots of people are moving to gears nowadays, but belt drives are still really good. So if you're looking for a budget belt drive, I definitely would highly consider going with the Boardnamics one. I've had really good success with them in the past, and I fully expect this client to be very happy with this brand new setup. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit more B-roll to end out the video here, but if you have any questions about the setup here, leave them in the comments below, and I can definitely answer this for you. And other than that, stay safe, keep on riding, and peace out.